din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și scut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Țări pe drum știut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. E pentru că pe lume partidul s-a dulci cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâcul de plin am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. самых окраин, южный гор до северных морей. Человек проходит, как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. Никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, подвиг и на труд. Над страной весенний ветер веет, с каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови мы насупим, если враг захочет нас сломать. Как небесную родину мы любим, бережем, как ласковую мать. Моя родная,
оклад, и нас не согреет треск речей под барабанный раскат. Марш левый, два, три, марш левый, два, три, взять ряды, товарищ, нам. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. И так как все мы люди, то должны мы, извините, что-то есть. Хотят накормить нас пустой болтовней, чертям спасибо за честь. Марш левый, два, три, марш левый, два, три, взять ряды, товарищ, нам. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. И так как ты рабочий, то не жди, что нам поможет другой. Себе мы свободу добудем твою своей рабочей рукой. Марш левый, два, три, марш левый, два, три, взять ряды, товарищ, нам. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. In der Arbeiter, Arbeitsfront, weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. Rein ein in der Arbeiter, Arbeitsfront, weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist.
Утреннего стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И он продолжает собой,
Greetings, everybody, and welcome. It is the afternoon of the 1st of September 2025. I hope you all enjoyed the summer because that is very much over now. So here we are with a live stream coming back to you following a few days away. And today is going to be focused on the what appears to be imminent, should we say, catastrophe facing Britain and France. We're going to be saying a few things about that, but I'm going to save the bulk of my comments on that for a more deep dive investigation into the nature of debt and what it means, and also like what debt to an imperialist country actually means. Because there's a lot to say on that specific point that isn't really getting covered in the bourgeois press. So what we're going to be just talking about today is why it is that the British press are suddenly filled with talk about the imminent need for Britain to undergo an IMF so-called bailout. And this also applies to the French. Now, the nominal reason for this is the very high debts that the British and French governments actually have. So, according to Reuters and also the Bank of England itself and the House of Commons library source, the debt to GDP ratio in Britain is 96.1%, meaning that Britain's debts equate to 96.1% of its annual GDP. Now, as we've discovered in the last 3 years, and arguably this goes on for much longer, the GDP metric, there's a measurement of like national wealth and productivity, is a fake metric because it counts all kinds of things which actually generate no real actual economic activity, such as debts, etc. Private debts. In the US case, they count like the generation of medical debt as being part of the GDP. And the imperialist countries have to do this because their economies have become almost entirely non-productive, and that's a big part of the reason why they use that measurement and why they were screaming for ages that the Russians have only got an economy the size of Italy or something, which again is patently untrue when you actually measure it in real terms. But to go back to the debt question, the British, talking specifically about Britain here, it's very high debt to GDP ratio, but of course it's not quite as bad as France, which has Britain's is 96.1%, France is 116%. Projected to be as high as 118.4% in 2026. So this is, of course, an even worse situation, or slightly worse situation. And in the French case, it's actually arguably the case that they're more exposed on their debt than even the British are. But we'll come to that when we dive into it in greater detail in the week. I want to focus just on the British question first. Now, Britain, of course, has a gigantic amount of debt, well over £1 trillion. And the question is, of course, why does this matter? Why does it matter that Britain is a country which, of course, has its own currency, which creates its own money out of thin air these days? So why does the fact that it has this very high debt actually matter? Well, the first question to actually answer is, well, who owns the British debt? That's an interesting question. So who owns the actual debt, and how is the debt accumulated? The debt is accumulated by the government via the selling of bonds. So they sell these to various different institutions, the bulk of which are actually in Britain itself. So if we look at who actually holds these bonds, which are sold by the Bank of England in order to generate money, the great bulk of them, or so at least the highest in single proportion, are owned by investors in Britain. So if we look at British debt, domestic investors own 70 to 75% of it. So that is quite a high, very high, particularly when we make the direct comparison to France. So of the domestic investors, it's approximately 30% of what is referred to as UK gilts, that's British debt, are owned by pension funds and insurance companies. Now, British debt, because even with its diminished status in the world, Britain is still regarded, or the British pound is still regarded as a safe place to invest, and British government debt is regarded as a safe investment. So pension funds and insurance companies like to buy up these things because they think they can get a regular and solid return on them. So that's 30% of UK gilts, as they're referred to, are owned by pension funds and insurance companies. Now, that's a particularly interesting statistic when you consider that one of the ways that the British ruling class, and particularly the Bank of England, the hierarchy of the Treasury, and the City of London guys, or certain elements of them, were the ones that came together to get rid of Liz Truss. And the way they did it was to destabilize the bond market, and particularly start raising questions about the viability of the government's ability to continue making the payments on British debt. And the reason why that caused such panic is precisely because there's so much debt, British government debt, held by pension funds in particular, but also the insurance companies. And if you destabilize that, then the domestic pensions industry could get absolutely destroyed. So it's a really great way of pressuring a government into doing something. If you threaten the viability of British debt, basically you could blow up the domestic pension and insurance companies, which would create chaos in Britain if those went under. Because in the case of the pension funds in particular, the government will be obliged to step in and bail them out to at least a certain extent. So that's 30% of British debt is owned by pension funds and insurance companies. Bear that in mind. The Bank of England itself holds approximately 8% of British government debt, which has been bought by the quantitative easing program. Now, if you remember the old, if you've been around on the British left for some time now, I mean, I've been politically active consistently now for 15 years, and inconsistently active before that. One of the things that sort of people who think they're tremendously clever and usually carry a picture of Milton Friedman in their wallets like to say to you is they like to throw that quote from Margaret Thatcher at you, which is where Thatcher says that the government's finances should be managed like that of a household. And she did this stunt where she went to a supermarket and counted change out of her purse as if she'd ever been short of money. But of course, households can't create debt with one hand and buy it up with another. Governments can. So the Bank of England holds at least 8% of British government debt. So they do that by buying it up. So they essentially, the government is lending to itself here. It creates money on the one hand, which becomes debt, and then the Bank of England then buys up that debt. Just as the same process goes on inside the US with the Federal Reserve, where the Federal Reserve was buying up large amounts of government debt and, of course, mortgage-backed securities for a long time following the financial crisis of 2008 to 2010. Now, there is another factor in British government debt, which is that a large amount of it is owned by banks and individual investment funds and individual investors. So this comes together at about 70 to 75% of British government debt is owned by individuals and entities inside Britain itself. So when people talk about the government debt, or when most of the media talks about it, they're not going to tell you about who actually owns it. It's owned by predominantly institutions inside institutions and individuals inside Britain itself. So this is when we say that debt is a key element of the class war, this is what we mean, which is the government essentially, first of all, lends money to itself, then buys up its own debts. The government's debts is bought up by, again, insurance companies, pension funds, banks, wealthy individuals as an investment vehicle. So when the government talks about, well, we can't, the government just can't pay its bills, and the question is, well, who are the bills owed to? And in the case of at least 8% debt, it's bills owed to itself. In the case of the debt that's owned by the British banks, well, the majority of the British banks were bailed out by the state between 2008 and 2010. So essentially, well, in that case, most of the British banks wouldn't exist without being bailed out by the state. So how can we now be in the position where where these institutions, which again could not exist without continued and ongoing state bailouts, are making claims upon the state for payment on debts that they've bought up from that state which bailed them out? That sounds absolutely bizarre and kind of slightly convoluted. The key thing to keep in mind is that the banks and the state and the Bank of England are basically circulating money around between themselves, and that the banks in particular could not exist without the continued and ongoing support of the British government and the Bank of England. But we're told that, oh, well, we have to pay our debts. Well, again, whose debts are they? Exactly. And what is the status of the institutions that apparently own these? Questions that should be asked, but which never are. So the other factor here is that this debt is owned predominantly by either the British state itself, but the bigger owners of it are individuals within the ruling class or ruling class controlled institutions. So rich individuals, but also, as I said, investment funds, banks, pension funds, insurance companies. So the great majority of this debt is, again, controlled by the British ruling class. So the British ruling class then demands that the government continue to make payments on this debt, and the rate of interest on the debt is a key part of why the debt keeps accumulating. If you remember back in 2010, in one of Britain's farcical so-called elections, which get more farcical every time, but one of the big arguments between the David Cameron, if you remember him, he was a sort of haunch of ham in human form, shrouded in a discarded condom, versus Gordon Brown, who looked like a sort of collapsed sponge cake poured into a ill-fitting suit, and then with a wig stuck on top of it. The arguments between them was over, well, who's going to pay off the debt? Can Britain pay its bills, etc., etc.? Again, a debate which was completely at odds with the reality, which is that the debt had exploded precisely because the government had essentially spent £1 trillion bailing out the banking system. And now we're told we're going into crisis because the government's debt is essentially becoming too high. But all of this debt has been accumulated, or the great bulk of it has been accumulated, in ways which are directly designed to benefit the ruling class. Just the same way that public sector debt is accumulated that way as well. So when they're talking about paying bills, just always keep it in mind that the great amount of debt that they're talking about is owned by the British ruling class itself and the institutions they control. So essentially, it's the British ruling class demanding a payout from the government. And we'll get to what that will mean in just a moment. But the other part of British debt is if 70 to 75% is owned by domestic institutions and individual investors, 20 to 25 to 30% of it is owned by other countries and international private investors. So foreign governments and foreign central banks hold around about 15% of British debt. So that's obviously an important amount. And also international private investors, including global pension funds, hedge funds, and asset managers, own around about, well, 10 to 15% of it. So that's not insignificant as well. So the foreign governments, central banks, and the international corporations and individuals that own 25 to 30% of British debt will also be insisting that the British government continues to make payments on that, that it continues to accumulate interest, that they continue to be able to draw profit from that debt. Now, how does this, of course, square with the talk of an IMF bailout? What does that actually mean? Is Britain going to go bankrupt? Well, the answer is no, of course. And here we get to the significance of debt under imperialism. Because why is it that British government just continues to print money endlessly, or should we say digitally create money? And why is this going to have a devastating long-term impact? Well, the supply and demand question comes in, which is that the more you create of something, the less value it actually has under capitalism. And what the British government and the American government have been relying on since at least 2008, arguably slightly before that, is their continued ability to essentially live off gigantic amounts of debt. The imperialist countries have been like racking up giant amounts of debt in the hope that they can sort of keep themselves afloat. And imperialism, in terms of its more developed stage, meaning Britain and America in particular, but also the French, the Germans, etc. But we're talking principally today about old perfidious Albion itself. The amount of debt that a late stage imperialist country has and holds on its books, for all of the advanced imperialist countries who are in a state of advanced decay, all of their debt just goes up and up and up. Why? Partly it's because of the lack of a productive base in the economy. If you look at Britain or the United States, but Britain in particular, the basis for the British economy is almost entirely parasitic, meaning that it doesn't actually produce much in terms of commodities anymore. It's not like the earlier days of imperialism where, as Lenin pointed out, the movement of capital was meant to facilitate the purchasing of like goods from the imperial core. So like the British would like loan large amounts of money to a colonized nation or a neo-colonial dependency in order that they could then buy British goods. That's now changed. Now the later stage imperialism operates as a more pure creation, which is that it's just about moving capital around. The purchase of British goods is almost secondary. It's the ability to move capital around, invest anywhere, exploit any source of labor, exploit any natural resource, dominate a whole country's market via the control of its government, institutions. This is the way that imperialism has evolved over time. And so when you have a domestic economy, and again, Lenin was analyzing things and clearly saw where things were going all the way back in 1916, because he forecast that the domestic economies of the imperialist nations, and he mentioned Britain in particular because he was drawing on the work of J.A. Hobson. The British economy, even back as early as like 1914, it was clear to intelligent observers, not even just Marxists, but anybody who could see where things were going, was even a liberal like Hobson, could see that it was being deindustrialized, and the movement was purely towards what Lenin referred to as the clipping of coupons, meaning the movement of capital around and the ruling class becoming divested from manufacturing and invested in making sure that the movement of money around the world continued, and they continued to clip their coupons, meaning draw their dividends from their shares in various different things. And this, of course, takes us back to the question of like, well, why is debt so important in a late stage imperialist economy? Well, it's so important because as the economy has become less and less productive, and since the massive crisis and an ongoing depression that started in 2008, that's 17 years ago now, the whole generation's grown up since then. Well, what's happened is that the British and the Americans, but again, we'll focus on Britain. The British government's been continually just digitally creating more and more money to paper over cracks, to paper over the fact that they haven't been able to or willing to do anything about the lack of productivity in the domestic economy, the fact that it's almost entirely parasitic, the fact that there are so many British private sector companies which are in essence zombies, meaning they can just about survive, stagger through each month, making payments on their debts. And if the cost of borrowing goes up severely or continues to go up, then there'll be a hell of a lot more bankruptcies and there'll be an explosion of unemployment. See, because when you're in a heavily financialized system with with a hollowed out economic productive base where everything's dependent upon debt and moving debt around, then if the cost of borrowing goes up for the government and then as a knock-on effect for businesses and individuals, that's devastating. Because what, domestically speaking, the British economy has been dependent on ever greater amounts of debt, probably since at least since the early 1980s. Why? Because the explosion of personal debt and business debt as well, as again since the late 70s, has been a key factor in the ability of the British ruling class to sustain themselves. So British wages for the great bulk of the working class have largely been stagnating in terms of real wages ever since the early 1980s. But at the same time, the consumer economy has been growing, or it has been until fairly recently. Now, how do you square that? Stagnant wages for large elements of the population, but also a continual expansion of consumerism. You square that by having ever expanding access to credit, which is why, like, personal debt in the advanced imperialist countries is so high, because they are doing this thing where they're freezing wages in the imperial core countries, and at the same time as they are encouraging people to spend more. So latest figures from Price Waterhouse Coopers, the big accountancy firm, is that household debt in Britain is over £2 trillion. And again, that's all kinds of debts, credit card debts, mortgage payments, etc. So the government and the wider ruling class encourages the working class and the petty bourgeoisie to continually spend more, to accumulate more debt, whilst at the same time wages stand still. And this is the result: an explosion of personal debt on one hand and an explosion of business debt on the other, because there are, as I already said, large numbers of businesses in Britain, and the same is true for the United States as well, which are essentially are zombie companies that rely upon their creditors being rather generous with them in terms of their ability to pay down their debts. So again, how many zombie companies are there in this country? Now, estimates vary, but it's somewhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 6, which are essentially in danger of imminently collapsing because of having a huge amount of debt. So any profit that they make just goes to servicing the debt, basically. Can just about keep the lights on. So if it's the case that assume that it's right in the middle, say it's like 1 in 8, because it's the figures from various different institutions say it's either like 1 in 6 or 1 in 10. So maybe if it's 1 in 8 of all businesses go bankrupt due to increased costs of borrowing, well, that's going to be another complete disaster for British capitalism and a source of great instability. So this is the reason why that the debt question is important under this stage of imperialism. Just to recap, first of all, because the system's become so heavily financialized that it can't just ignore its debts, nor can it just get out of them, because it needs to continue printing money to paper over the cracks and contradictions in the system. And it needs to encourage also greater personal and business level indebtedness, because of in the wages cases, they are completely unwilling to raise wages. And in the case of businesses. They've encouraged the growth of so-called small business, but in a completely unsustainable way, because of course you're encouraging the growth of small businesses at the same time that people have less and less to spend. So the businesses have to rely on ever greater amounts of credit to survive. This is the debt trap that the imperialist countries are in. And it's a case of where the ruling class essentially tries to cover up one problem and ends up creating another. They try to get themselves out of the hole that they fell into in the 60s by attacking the working class continually, and also being continually, shall we say, determined to destroy all working class organization like trade unions that could effectively like bargain for higher wages. And at the same time, they wanted the working class to spend more. So of course they encouraged the explosion of like credit card debt, mortgage debt, etc. So this is the end point of that. Like, so personal debt explodes, business debt explodes, and then later on, the debt that the state itself incurs explodes as well. Because again, rather than actually tackle the problem of parasitism, which is the central problem of the British economy, they keep trying to essentially put off the nasty problem for themselves. By racking up more debts, and why they are now thinking of going for, or now there's talk of an IMF bailout, is related to this. The biggest question, or the biggest factor, I should say, behind the IMF bailout isn't that it's not the question of the IMF coming in and basically paying off £1 trillion worth of British debt. That's not what's going to happen. That's not what happened in the 1976 crisis. What the IMF does is, of course, step in and gives us a loan to a certain amount, which is then designed essentially to do two things. Firstly, it's meant to reassure the holders of British debt or French debt that the government is able to continue to pay the interest, at least, on that debt, so that the owners of it can continue to see a return on it. And the way in which the IMF does that is that they will give, say, I don't know, a £4.5 billion loan or something like that, or it'll be higher in the British case, but let's just use this figure at the moment, which will then go straight through the system and be used to, if we look at the case of Greece, it was used to pay off the bondholders, the holders of Greek debt. Then what will happen is the government will present a plan for wage freezes and spending cuts, which will then, of course, be presented to the creditors, Britain's creditors. Remember, though, that 70 to 75% of the owners of British debt are domestic British institutions, insurance companies, pension funds, banks, rich individuals, asset managers, etc. So and then 20 to 25% is owned by foreign institutions. So the debt holders will be shown a plan whereby Britain will restore its financial credibility by 2030 by making the following cuts. It won't work, of course. It won't work because, for the reasons we've been talking about, British economy will remain wholly unproductive. It will remain parasitic. It won't, and also the British ruling class won't be able to encourage a domestic spending boom because they won't raise wages above the rate of inflation. They will continue using the same old failed tactics, which are continually inflating the property bubble, continually trying to ensure that there is a very low cost to borrowing. By the way, this is what Trump is trying to do with the American economy. It's why he's like firing central bank, Federal Reserve governors, or trying to anyway, or removing them, because what he wants to do, or maybe not Trump himself, but what he's been told is a good idea, is that he needs to reduce the cost of borrowing. So in order that more loans can be taken out, that the that the zombie companies in the United States are able to continue to take out more debt to service the current debt, and individuals in the United States that can take out more debt in order to purchase things, purchase consumer goods, purchase homes, etc., purchase cars. So the only plan that they've really got is to bring down the cost of borrowing and basically have another credit fueled boom, or try to. That's the only plan they've got, because anything else would involve actually challenging the interests of the ruling class itself. It's been the only plan they've been working with since 2008, which is try desperately to restore the pre-2008 system, and it keeps not working. So in terms of the IMF loan in 1976 to Britain, again, we'll go into this in more detail in a future episode, but that was designed specifically to create an ideological justification for the attacks of the Labour government led by Jim Callaghan and the later Thatcher government. So that was the big reason that was taken out. It was not to do with the fact that Britain was bankrupt or something like that. It was designed to justify a wholesale assault on welfare, on the regime of welfare capitalism as it had existed up until 1976. It was designed to justify the dismantling of it, because look how little both back then the British government and the British media and the British government and media now, look at how little they actually explain what is going on. They say Britain's bankrupt, Britain's bankrupt, Britain's bankrupt, but it's very rare that they will sit down and actually explain to you who the debt is owed to, why it was incurred, why it matters so much that the cost of borrowing is kept down. Now, they're thinking there will be some on the Keynesian side of things, MMTers, etc., who will say that what's actually needed is actually more government borrowing, as long as that borrowing is invested productively, and that demand can be stimulated inside the economy. Now, what that ignores in some cases, not all, some Keynesians are in favor of what they refer to as some sort of radical transformation. But what it usually ignores is the fact that the entire, almost entirely non-productive nature of British capitalism. Again, same is true for the United States. It's non-productive and becoming even more non-productive all the time. So let's go back to the question of where this goes. What will be done if the Starmer government does go to the IMF for this so-called bailout? This will be like a new version of what was done in 1976, which it'll be there to justify a further attacks on government spending, attacks on wages, etc., with the idea that they keep borrowing costs down, and also that the British government's ability to pay off the interest on its debt is seen as credible. So it's basically the IMF is a tool of imperialism, but it's also a tool of domestic class war. It's it is shown, it's held up to the domestic population to say, look, the IMF had to step in. Oh my God, Britain must do radical things. Sacrifices must be made. What they never tell you is who's benefiting from the debt. And the answer to that is always the ruling class themselves. They hold the great amount of British debt. It's payment that goes to them. And the fact is that what we should actually be saying is that this is debt which in essence has been accumulated in order to preserve the parasite class in power. So therefore, it's debt that simply should not be paid. It should be renounced. That's the actual way to look at it. We should explain it clearly to people about what this debt really means, what it represents, what the IMF represents, what they aim to do with us, and what they aim to justify doing to us. And therefore, we should say that this debt is something which was accumulated by the ruling class, and therefore the can should be carried by the ruling class. What they're aiming to do, though, is to justify passing on the debt and the crisis in terms of costs to the working class, the way they always do. And what we should say is there was a great old German slogan from about 2009, when I was in Berlin. I saw this on a poster. It said, "Wir zahlen nicht für Ihre Krise," meaning we will not pay for your crisis. And that is what we should say. That is what we should organize around. We will not pay for via our living standards, our ability to have a decent life. We will not pay for the crisis caused by the ruling class. And that should be our slogan going forward. Okay, so I'm going to come back to the IMF question later this week. So we'll return to it then. But I wanted to make some preliminary remarks today. So just going to the top of the chat here. Be sure to like and share this stream if you haven't done so already. So let's see. Thanks to all. How many have we got watching here? Let's just have a look. All 300 odd of you watching at the moment. Good to have you with us. So just going back to the top, Tim Gray, Comrade Lee, good afternoon to you both. Tim Gray asks, looking back at the 1976 IMF bailout, what could the government of the day do differently, or was it always a con designed to usher in a direct conflict in Britain? Well, it's always been the class war is constant. It just varies in terms of its intensity. But I mean, there were those at the time in the Labour Party who, however unrealistically, presented like certain different things they could have done. Like, was it absolutely necessary for the government to take that bailout at that time? Was the pound about to collapse? Well, the thing is, the ruling class whose plot it was to force that IMF bailout were perfectly willing to risk the further collapse of the currency. But as we saw with Liz Truss, there are costs to doing that. Even if you then suddenly declare the crisis is over. But they wanted to end the regime of welfare capitalism as it had existed until that time. They weren't able to just, pull up the drawbridge, so to speak, and declare an end to it. They had to proceed more cautiously than that. But the aim was to destroy the concessions that had been made post 1945, and you needed something like an IMF bailout to sort of ram home the point in the minds, particularly of the petty bourgeoisie and a certain section of the working class, that there was no alternative, to quote Margaret Thatcher. Now, Tony Benn, and others on the Labour left did present alternatives, particularly a lot of these related to capital controls, because the big fear was that there was going to be mass capital flight out of Britain. And so Benn and others put forward the idea of controlling capital, which is always a sort of classic reformist thing. Of course, the Parliamentary Labour Party and the cabinet were most right-wingers, pro-capitalist types, completely controlled by the ruling class. And so they rejected Benn's plan and any other alternative other than spending cuts and wage freezes. So that's what they always go for. It is worth noting, though, that the Labour government was actually elected in 1974 on a radical-looking manifesto that promised to fundamentally restructure the British economy towards things such as worker control over industry. That's what Tony Benn was sent to the Department of Trade and Industry to do. And of course, he chronicles in his diaries how the senior civil servants effectively blocked him, and how he was stunningly ineffective at actually being able to do anything about the thing that he was supposedly elected on. Luca says, I recently came across how big the symbolism of the Ethiopian empire is in reggae music. You got me wondering about the politics beyond that connection. Do you have any insights? I don't, in actual fact. I mean, I listened to quite a bit of reggae music over the years, but I've never really looked in. I mean, the Ethiopian symbolism is very heavy there, but I haven't looked into it much beyond that. Luca follows up by saying, I've always found curious, Bob Marley was signed to a London-based label. Why would the UK promote music rooted in Jamaican resistance and African identity, to better control it. I mean, first of all, reggae music started to sell. When if something sells, then, well, the British are going to want a slice of the action. Plus, if you control or you can promote the big reggae acts, you can have certain degree of control over the content of their music, push it in certain directions, etc. I think this is part of the reason why, like, Peter Tosh left the Wailers, because he was the guitarist on the first album, I think, and went solo, was because, I mean, he objected to the control that he saw that was being exercised by was it Island Records and Chris Blackwell, who was the major executive there, over the musical direction of the Wailers. I mean, that's is something I've seen interviews with the late great Peter Tosh where he's talking about that. So that's a part of the reason, I think. Good afternoon to Jerry. Bertram Clement says, best book that details what happened to former Soviet and communist countries post 1991 in terms of economic living standards collapsing, elections being rigged against communist parties. In terms of post-Soviet Russian politics, I would recommend all of the books written by Professor Richard Sakwa. Again, he's more of a sort of a left liberal than anything else, but his information is very good. I'd also say that for the post-Soviet Russian economy, the study written by Richard Conley is good. I'd also recommend that you go through the studies done by the Communist Party of the Russian Federation on the grounds that they have put quite a lot into, like, obviously examining the 1990s, and their analysis is, of course, live from the place where a lot of these events took place. So I would say look at the books by Sakwa, look at the economic studies of post-communist Russia done by Connolly, and look at the analysis of the KPRF for Russia in particular. That answers your question. HM says, following your party and is currently at crisis point before it's even launched, the Corbyn faction won't commit to being anti-Zionist and the trans ideologists are going crazy. Farce. Of course farce. There's always going to be a farce. The fundamental problem here is that Corbyn and your party, though in reality it's his party, and you are merely allowed to sit there and watch him, is not going to have a democratic structure. It's not going to have a particularly democratic conference. It's controlled by a tiny clique around Corbyn himself. And they've already all fallen out with each other. And it's only like, what, a month in? And they've fallen out with each other over anti-Zionism, which of course Corbyn won't commit to. And Zara Sultana rather belatedly has done, and is being sort of frozen out as a result. Now, what's the fundamental problem here facing this attempt to sort of refloat British social democracy? The fundamental problem is that it's trying to do something that when the economic base to do it just simply isn't there. As we've just been talking about how unproductive and parasitic British imperialism is, British domestic capitalism is. And Corbyn is trying to refloat like post-World War II welfare capitalism at a time when the system is just too far gone to take it. So, and this is why we say that, like, Corbyn and co were part of the Labour Party for many years. They sat there watching as the Labour Party made war on the working class and mumbled objections, but said and did nothing. And now when the things have run out of road there because the Starmer regime's too dumb, actually, and too much under the control of the most rabid reactionary sections of the British ruling class, to realise that had they just left Corbyn alone and Sultana alone, they'd still just be sitting there now mumbling objections. But because, like an element of the ruling class is feeling more and more insecure, quite rightly, because of the level of the crisis that they're in, they chose to try and like stamp all over these people, and in the end drove them out in a way that they would never have just left on their own. Now, the point, to go back to the point about why this is in crisis, though, it's in crisis because there is no basis to do the things that Corbyn says he wants to do. The economic basis for it just simply doesn't exist. In this sense, like, the reactionaries are telling the truth to a certain degree, which is that when they say, we can't afford this, and the answer we can provide is, yes, your system can't afford it. Your system can't afford any mild reform that Corbyn and Sultana might want to do, if we take their promises seriously. And so it comes back to the question of, well, if this thing is basically trying to recreate something which can't be recreated, if it's already at a time when anti-Zionism is becoming a more and more popular, not just an acceptable position, but like an accepted position, at a time when opposition to imperialism has been escalating due to like the almost the 2 years of continued mass murder by US imperialism and its Israeli proxy. Why on earth is Corbyn resisting the idea of describing the party as anti-Zionist? Why is he still like desperately trying to not say that? And the answer comes in two parts. First of all, the personnel that he is surrounded with are, well, they include people who are not only Zionists of one description or another, but they include people who, it has been alleged, are either intelligence assets themselves or who are close to intelligence assets. The name James Schneider has been bandied around as somebody who's an example of a man who is either an intelligence asset or is close to people who are British intelligence assets. And the reason why they, of course, aren't going to go down the anti-Zionist route is because, well, some of them are ideologically committed to Zionism. They would say in its left form, though that was always the idea that Zionism having a left was always a myth, is what I mean. But also, more widely, if Corbyn is to get anywhere, if welfare capitalism is to be brought back, then it can only be done under the auspices of a revived British imperialism, because it was only really British and US imperialism that were able to fund the concessions that are made to the domestic working class in 1945 to 51. It was imperialism which funded all of that. And so to actually have a revived welfare capitalism, British imperialism would have to be revived. And if British imperialism is to be revived, its position in West Asia has to be protected. And its position in West Asia is dependent upon what? Israel, which helps, along with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, etc., which the British relationship with Zionism and Wahhabism helps to keep the country, or the peoples of West Asia and North Africa, divided along false geographical boundaries, which the British and the French largely drew. And the continued existence of Israel and the Wahhabist regime in Saudi Arabia and its associated entities, the continued existence of all of these are absolutely vital for the British ruling class holding down their position of influence, of power within West Asia. If Bell goes down, as Hassan Nasrallah once said, then the influence of the British and the United States imperialists, well, in the region, that's going to be fatally compromised. And also it'll fatally compromise the Wahhabist regime in Saudi Arabia and its Gulf state satellites. And if those go, then that's the end of British and American imperialism and French imperialism, what's left of it, in West Asia. And that's the root of why Corbyn won't actually commit to calling himself an anti-Zionist. There's the other factors there too, such as the personnel factor, the sort of woolliness of his politics. But at root, it's because Corbyn is an imperialist. He wants an imperialism. He's a utopian because he wants an imperialism which is cleaned up, which signs all kinds of documents and declarations about human rights, which puts a smiley face on things, which doesn't engage openly in war crimes. But he wants a revived British imperialism. He'll waffle and blabber about like human rights, about good things, not bad things, about abiding by the UN Charter and all that kind of thing. But his politics depend upon a revived British imperialism. There's no doubt about that. That's the root of the crisis in his movement, because at a time when the trend of the population is more and more towards anti-imperialism, Corbyn's trying to revive a politics which is dependent upon imperialism. That's the root of this problem. And this is one of the big part of the reason why many of us will continue to point out these problems, because it's not going to take too long for them to fully reveal themselves in terms of the severe limitations of this party, given its alignment with imperialism, and also given that its politics are based upon the same things that the Labour Party's politics are based upon, which is, even if we take its commitment seriously, it's based upon the idea of a chosen elite headed by Saint Jeremy handing down reforms to the working class. And there are some who argue that, oh well, Corbyn was not the real deal, but he's leading us in the right direction. Well, this is simply false. It's false. He's leading people back in the direction that's a failure, that ushered in a welfare capitalist regime which misled people systematically for years about how socialism could be achieved, and also that led the working class into further collaboration with imperialism. So this isn't leading us in the right direction at all. It's leading us backwards. It's leading us to a situation where working class people might get invested in this party, but this party cannot achieve any of the things that it says it wants to, and also which leads people in the direction of failed and useless tactics. So it isn't leading us in the right direction at all. So let's carry on here. And of course, they're all into the trans shit, because of course that's the state of the modern left. They just take their opinions on many things from the left wing of the ruling class. Hello to Sophia, Community Snide Lines, Cooper Ward in the Midwest of the USA. Zim Left Radio says, could you please touch on the migrant hotel protests in Britain? Yeah, I will do so. Just going to a quick intermission, and then I'll be right back with you. I'm just going to go grab some more coffee. So bear with me. Be sure to like and share the stream, and I'll be back in just about 2 minutes. Hello again, everybody. So back again. So let's carry on here. So Zim Left Radio was asking us about the migrant hotel protests in Britain. Now, if you're not familiar with this, this is a perfidious Albion specific story, which is based around the problems that have been, I would say, created by the system itself with regard to the dispersion of migrant populations around the country. Now, because the game that's been played with regard to migration and with regard to the stirring up of racism or racialism, I think is the more accurate term, by the ruling class over many, many years, anything to do with this is always sort of a matter of like unpicking the propaganda. So the immediate cause of the protests, which, by the way, are state-backed, bear that in mind, is the fact that you have large numbers, and we'll go into this in a video specific to this question later this week. You have large numbers of migrants, asylum seekers, especially refugees, etc., stuck into private hotels as accommodation. Now, this isn't the first time this has happened. Like hotels, bed and breakfasts, etc., have been used to stash basically anybody that the government doesn't really know what to do with, or have a particular plan for many years now. It's also the case that in these hotels, you have a lot of homeless people. You have a lot of people who have like drug addiction problems, mental health issues, etc. So it's not just that they're stashing migrants in these hotels; it's that they're sticking like large numbers of people with specific problems. And then what happens is, when problems emerge, when there's like, criminality emerges around these hotels, when some of the people they stash in there turn out to be criminals themselves and engage in criminal behavior, this is then seized upon by various elements within the ruling class's propaganda machine and turned into this kind of like giant scandal. Now, the protests themselves, and I've seen one of them, are being organized by ultra-reactionary types, fascist elements, the followers of Mr. Yaxley Lennon, the actor Stephen Yaxley Lennon and co. And that's something that's you can be observed by just looking at like, well, who turns up at these things? It's often people with like, it's often like paid fascist agitators. And the reason why the ruling class is actually encouraging this, and I say they're encouraging it partially because all of the major political forces in Britain, be it Labour Party, Tories, Farage, are all constantly talking about this. I mean, the immigration issue has always been used to sow divisions within the working class. And that's why it's a favorite of the ruling class to go back to over and over again, despite the fact that, of course, they all know very well that they're never going to put a stop to immigration. Immigration is something that the system very much needs. That's why, as I've said many times, like all of the populist right-wingers who get in other countries in Europe, like Meloni, like the upcoming Le Pen presidency, because she will get in eventually, they all talk this big game, and then when it comes down to it, don't deliver. Same way Trump himself isn't. Trump is deporting fewer people than Biden did, but he's doing it in a more melodramatic and militaristic fashion, which is what basically every single round of so-called immigration reform has done since at least 20 years now. The immigration controversies are created precisely to avoid actually talking about what causes vast population flows out of the neo-colonial world and into the imperial core nations. and why it is that the ruling class needs that continual flow of easily exploitable labor. No, certainly the Labour Party is not going to talk about that. The Tories have no interest in talking about that. Farage, perversely, like in his earlier incarnation, did periodically talk about that when he was a Euro MP, in a way that he would do it to accuse the EU of destabilizing countries and causing migrant flows. So he's the one who, in his previous incarnation, did mention it in a somewhat skewed fashion. But none of them want to talk about it now. What they're all concerned with, and this is why these protests and the counter protests are being promoted, is because the system is in deep trouble. They realize, the ruling class does, that they're going to be carrying out some very, very unpopular attacks on the working class. And so they need as many distractions as possible. And so they need as many, this protest needs to be amplified. Like the protests outside these hotels, I mean, in terms of actual numbers, are relatively small. Like you get a few hundred each time. And that's with round-the-clock coverage on the TV, round-the-clock coverage in newspapers, on radio, on all the major outlets. Interestingly enough, one of the most fanatical anti-migrant and also anti-Muslim TV stations, that is, of course, GB News, its parent company is registered in the UAE, which just goes to show the role that the UAE plays in terms of being a sort of an adjunct to British imperialism. But I digress slightly. Let's continue to look at the question. So you get the right wingers, the reactionaries, fascist types turning up at these hotels, protesting about migrants being stashed there. And then you get the left, which then takes the bait, who then come and say, like, oh, we will do that. You get St. Jeremy giving another sermon on the Mount, saying we must defend the migrants, etc. We must basically just defend the status quo. The thing is, nobody, other than a tiny number of us, puts forward that the actual problem and the actual solution I hear are, or should be, quite simple, but can't be addressed under this current system, which is that what a big part of the reason why the migrants are getting hotels thing talking point is taken up is because there is a housing crisis in Britain. People are unable to get housing because of the private model, private for-profit model around which housing policy is built in this country doesn't work. So you have increasing numbers of homeless people. You have increasing numbers of people stuck in temporary accommodation. And so given that that is the situation, like anything which can be seen as like somebody, migrants cutting to the front of the queue or something like that, anything which can be used therefore to trigger, or should we say to tap into the justified anger that people do have and distract it, well, the ruling class is going to wanting to be promoting that, because far better for the British ruling class to have people like going to getting angry about migration and migrants living in hotels than actually looking at the reason why there is a housing crisis. And the left plays into this as well. The left plays into it because they'll talk about, well, we need more housing, etc. But when it comes to like these migrant hotel protests, what people should be doing is pointing out the reality, which is that the hotel owners and the government are in a racket together. They're in a racket together because the more, it's not just migrants that are being stashed in hotels. It's, again, homeless people, drug addicts, people with mental health problems, all being stashed in these hotels. And the hotels are making a ton of money off it. Millions and millions are being spent by like big city councils on this across Britain. And it's a scandal that people are pushed into a hotel room and told to live there. Nobody should be told to go and live in a fucking hotel room. It's ridiculous. You can't live like that. Not really. And so it should be the case that what is done is that if you were in St. Jeremy's position, what you should do is say that look, this is happening because the entire model is wrong. It's happening because, like, in terms of migration numbers, the British government is both the cause of the uprooting of people and their willingness to travel into the imperial core countries to be hyper exploited, and of course has no intention of ever doing anything to reduce the numbers, and cannot reduce the numbers because it needs a continual expansion of the hyper exploitable labor force. So you should be pointing out that nobody should be stuck in a hotel for months and months on end. Not if they're British, not if they're a migrant. Nobody. Like, hotel accommodation should be used in this basis as an absolute last resort, and even then only for a few days at a time, which is what they're built for. Hotels are built to stay in for a few days at a time. Like, I can't stay in one for more than a couple of days without going mad because you're staying in one fucking room. And the way to address this is by fundamentally changing the housing policy. Now, as Tom Wolfe points out in the comments, it's not even that that there is a chronic shortage of actual buildings. It's that there's a chronic shortage of, well, there's a chronic problem of distribution of housing, and that's another thing to emphasize here. See, in England alone, there are 700,000 homes which are registered as being empty, with 265,000 of them classed as long-term vacant. So there's your homeless problem taken care of straight away. And more than that, we also need to point out then that the private for-profit housing model is bankrupt, it's bust. It's never going to be able to provide for the needs of the people, and it needs to go. So it's not a question of the fact that there aren't enough housing. There aren't enough houses. There clearly are. If there's 700,000 empty houses in England alone, like, why on earth is anybody homeless? If there's 265,000 of them which are long-term, like registered as being long-term and empty, then again, no need for anybody to be homeless. There's no need really to stick migrants in hotels or people with addiction problems or homeless people or anything like that. It's not a question of the fact that we can't build homes. It's a question of the fact that there is a crisis caused by the profit system, because homes that are built, the model that's been used since the early 1980s is that it's got to be private developments and it's got to be sold for profit, and people have got to put themselves in a vast amount of debt in order to actually buy a home. So the thing is, we need to end that model. But of course, to go back to the British debt question, or the French debt question, or the American debt question, the fact is that somebody, and it is a few individuals within the ruling class, are making an awful lot of money out of this private housing model, and they don't want to see it come to an end. And they would rather cause riots, in fact, they would love to see ever greater division within the working class. The right and the left basically engaging in puppet theatre over this, all the usual crap to avoid addressing the fact that the for-profit housing model will need to end. And this is the reason why these protests are being promoted. Right, what's the principal reason is to defend the for-profit housing model. It's to make sure that no change comes about and that people's anger gets diverted down cul-de-sacs. So if you're like somebody who's angry about migration, you'll be diverted down the cul-de-sac of voting for reform or joining up with any of these like fascist guys who are basically just like, just like the Tories or the Labour Party, but with slightly more tattoos. It's in practical terms, the interests they defend are exactly the same. Or if you're on the left, you'll end up like trailing around after useless organizations such as Stand Up to Racism, standing there essentially defending the indefensible, which is that it's indefensible to stick anybody long term into a hotel and call it like a viable accommodation plan. It's not. And more broadly, everything to do with this is a racket. The private housing market is a racket. The hotel owners are running a racket where they get paid for stashing people in often like appalling conditions for a long period of time. And the politicians are involved in a racket because they all know fundamentally that they're not going to actually change this model at all. Nigel Farage isn't stupid. He knows what will be demanded of him when he gets into office, and he knows he will deliver on it. Just as, by the way, he's changed his opinions on the Ukraine war according to the demands of the ruling class. He'll change his mind on immigration as well, just like Donald Trump has. Right. So, moving on. Hello to Paul and Huda and Terry Eaton and Anthony McKeown and Luxy223 and Daniel and Jerry points out, doesn't Japan have a debt to GDP ratio of 250%? At the moment, it's 200%. So I think it's 200% in Japan. We did a program a long time ago when it was myself and my former podcasting partner Layla, if any of you remembers that era, a good 3 years ago now. We did a program where we specifically looked at Japan and argued that basically that was the future, which is like very high debt to GDP ratio, long-term decline of wages, and essentially economic stagnation. And this is exactly where all the imperialist countries are going. They're going to try all these different tricks to revive themselves. Fundamentally, none of it will work, and you just end up with more and more stagnation and decline. As Japan went 30 years ago, so Britain, France, others will follow. So America will follow as well. Imperialism, in the end, only invites stagnation, decay, and collapse. Right. Dave C says, Alexander Mercouris on the round recently called these financial problems fixable. Well, he's wrong about that. Presumably through welfare cuts and stopping funding the Ukraine war. Duran gives me libertarian vibes, or am I wrong? I'm not sure about libertarianism. I think Mercouris is an old social democrat. But theoretically, it's fixable, but no one's going to do anything about it for the reasons I've outlined. Also, stopping funding the Ukraine war, this is a total misunderstanding, by the way, that needs to be reflected upon. The reason why the British ruling class still fund the Ukraine war and will continue to fund it until they fall down dead is because the nature of the massive crisis in the system that can only be addressed by causing the collapse of Russia, Iran, China, all three, so that British capital can get in there and despoil these places and asset strip them. It's not the case that funding the Ukraine war is a waste of money for the ruling class. It was their ticket out of the situation. Remember, they were in a big crisis in the 1970s and 80s that really they only got out of because they essentially, due to the counter-revolution in the USSR, the entire socialist world basically collapsed, other than China, which became sort of a strange hybrid, and Vietnam, which followed the same model, and Cuba, which is too small and isolated. But the entire socialist and anti-imperialist world was essentially almost destroyed in the 1990s, and it enabled British, American, French, German, Italian capital to rampage all over the world for decades, unopposed. And that delayed the reckoning that was due with for these imperialist countries. And therefore, the only thing that can get them out of this, really, is that they will look to despoil, asset strip, destroy other countries, particularly the countries which serve as points of resistance to them. Excuse me. So it's not that the Ukraine war is wasting money. You can argue that it is, but it's that the British ruling class absolutely has to keep that going because it's their only chance to get out of the hole that they are in. Right. Good afternoon to Davey, Working Pro Incorporated, Francois Rabelais, who says, Duran very much establishment. I'll never forget Mercouris describing October the 7th as geopolitically uninteresting. Yeah, I do suspect that he has Zionist sympathies, to be honest. But not suspect, it's pretty much damn certain Okay. Pavel asks, how did you assess the situation of debt with regards to Germany and France? Does the same assessment hold true? The complication with Germany and France is the euro, or what the big complication is. So what I'm going to do, Pavel, is I'm going to do like an IMF special later in this week where I'm going to go through each of the major countries and talk about their debts and why why this matters and what the likely outcome is, particularly for Britain and France, but Germany also. Germany is the key to the entire Eurozone. Like if Germany goes down or changes tactics, then the entire Eurozone is gets called into question. I mean, the entire Eurozone might self-finished off. So get well soon to Jenny, who's had apparently abdominal surgery. Hope you're doing all right, comrade. Okay, so I'm going to have to bring to a close for today because I've got a series of tasks I have to complete outside of things. But there will be a Decline and Fall episode being recorded tomorrow, which will go out via the Substack in tomorrow evening. We'll be looking at the assassination of Andrei Parubi, the fascist former Rada speaker in Lvov the other day. Was it the Russians? Was it his own fascist friends or former friends? Was it the British getting rid of unwanted assets? And what else is going on with the Ukraine war? Join us for a discussion of that tomorrow. I'll be back later in the week with a discussion of the financial situation and economic situation of the major European countries, Britain, France, Germany in particular. So I will come back to you with that. That's probably going to be on Wednesday. We'll have the latest episode in our series Debunking Anti-Communism is coming up. That's going to be next week, and that's going to deal with the Holodomor and other myths around it. So be sure to tune in for that. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. Couldn't do the show without your support. More things coming up on the Patreon pretty soon. But until tomorrow, when we return with the Decline and Fall episode, thank you for tuning in. And be sure to like and share this and subscribe to the channel. And I'll be back with you again tomorrow.
Небо утреннего стяг, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжается бой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.